And we just woke up.
All right. Yeah. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here with Fernando, and we're going to be starting a series with this video on the ancient Indian horoscopic astrological text called the Yavanajataka. Roughly translates as the horoscopy of the Greeks. And this is...
Wait a minute. How come there's I'm sorry, this is a Vedic text. Why are you talking about Greeks? I'm sorry, this is not the video I wanted to be in. I'm sorry.
Those pesky Greeks, what are they doing making their way into Vedic astrology?
Why are you patronizing this Eurocentric perspective,
I know, right?
about Jyotish? I mean, what's going on?
Jesus Christ. Well, yeah, I don't know, man. What are we going to do about this? I'm, the astrology police are coming to get me right now. But
yeah, you're going to see the comments.
Yeah.
Well, continue. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, anyway, so this text is possibly the oldest horoscopic text from India that we have, although that is sort of maybe starting to be disputed. The dates on it are changing a little bit. But as we've talked about, meaning you and I, not me and the audience, whoever's watching, but you and I, basically a bit of history on this, according to David Pingree, who's the scholar who translated this text into English a while back. Basically, that this edition was written by somebody named Spujit Vaja, dated to about 270 CE. Right, 270 CE or AD, and it's a versified version of a prose translation made by Yavaneshvara, which is a name that means the Lord of the Greeks, in the year 149-150 CE or AD. So it's theoretically a text that dates back to the 2nd century CE, but if we read between the lines, it's probably a lot of its source material is even older than this, because again, Spujit Vaja is making a versified version of a prose translation by Yavaneshvara, which doesn't even mean that Yavaneshvara was the author. He may have just been yet another translator of some kind. And Lord of the Greeks is clearly a title, not an actual name. So the text is very mysterious. Many of the techniques are distinctly Indian in the sense that we don't see a lot of the techniques in Hellenistic texts.
A lot.
Yeah, quite a lot. But there are some distinct similarities that we'll talk about, like the doctrine of sect and, a couple other things like that. By and large, it's a very unique text. Like I said, I think it is distinctly Indian. And, Hellenistic astrology is not actually Greek necessarily for those listening. Most of the Hellenistic authors, astrologers, and the texts they wrote they were written in Greek, which was the scholarly language of the age, but they come from places like Egypt, modern-day Lebanon, modern-day Turkey. One author was purportedly from Sicily, which is a very unique, interesting place in itself. And so I really don't even consider Hellenistic astrology or Greek civilization to be Western as we think of it today. It happens to be part of the continent we call Europe, but it's very much a Mediterranean culture, and it shares quite a lot in common with the more Eastern cultures. And in fact, many people don't know it, but Greek medicine and Ayurvedic medicine are extraordinarily similar. And Plato himself talks about similar concepts to certain Indian yogis. Like he talks about the 3 channels that run up the body, the Sushumna, Ida, and Pingala. And there were a doctrine of chakras in ancient Greece as well. And so, to me, it's really not, none of this is Western, it just is what it is. So the fact that Hellenistic astrology may have influenced early Indian horoscopic astrology is just part of the fact that ancient cultures intermingled constantly in ancient history. And so no one civilization can lay claim to the beauty of astrology.
Well, in a historical context, to follow your introductory comments, the concept of Europe wasn't even invented. We're talking about
That's good to know.
the second century AD. I mean, Greeks had more in common with the Persian Empire than they did
Yes.
the barbarians that were in Norway or in the British Isles. I mean, in a way, the Mediterranean, the Levant, the Middle East, and obviously the old continent of Asia, including India and China, that was the known world, and they in a way became the propulsors of what would become Europe, because these were the first thinkers, these were the
Right.
first societies that had extensive written material. And as you said, Greek was the lingua franca, the frank tongue, the academic tongue that people use to transmit scientific, artistic, and in this case, philosophical and metaphysical knowledge. So it was the sprouting of what would later become European civilization through transmission through Rome, and then from Rome to the whole of the continent. So
Yeah.
in a way, Hellenistic astrology is not Western astrology, because
No.
it precedes the concept of the West,
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
is more of a Christian
It is.
concept, a more, I don't want to say modern concept, but it's
But it's a Christian concept of like
yes,
the West versus the East. We're going to go
correct, and
Israel and the Holy Land, and it's
exactly,
us against them. That's
yeah,
a very Christian thing. And
and that's the
Christianity,
West.
ironically, is a more Eastern religion anyway.
Yeah, I mean,
too.
that's well, that's the thing. I mean, Europe was strongly influenced by Mediterranean cultures. Greek,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Italy,
And African.
subsequent Judeo influences,
Yeah.
and then that got mixed with the Nordic and the native Europeans, who later on became known as what we know as pagan. But that's we're getting way
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. So
But,
anyway, but
but the thing is that as you said, Hellenistic astrology or Western astrology or Mediterranean astrology or Greco-Roman astrology, it is something that is not like pure. It has elements from Egyptian culture, for example, the division of the skies, the decans, and it has elements from Babylonian cultures, from
yes.
Chaldea, which would be more or less the 12 Rashis. And we don't know where that knowledge even came from. I mean, we don't know where the Egyptians got that knowledge. We don't know where the Babylonians got that knowledge.
Yeah,
Could have
we
been
don't.
from India, could have been from, I don't know, Atlantis. Nobody knows really, but that's more or less the occult or the mysterious roots of, the astrological tradition. And when Indians think about, oh, that's Western, the reality is that there's no such thing as a purely Western astrology. There's no such thing as a pure astrology, because if you study the history of astrology, it's just a bunch of guys, copy pasting a lot of ideas together
Yeah.
from here and from there, and that's basically what we're still doing today, to this date, in 2018 in the internet. So the idea of a very puritanical approach to astrology, in my opinion, is not necessarily the correct way to approach astrology, because most of the traditions are just syncretic in nature. Of course, there are elements that are very native to some traditions. For example, the nakshatras to India. We can say that the nakshatras per se are Indian, right? We could also say that maybe some Hellenistic techniques are native to Hellenistic astrology. We could also say later on that certain techniques are explicitly Persian. We could say that some things
Yeah.
are
Of
explicitly
course. Right.
Chinese, especially things that have to do with the I Ching. There are certain elements that, and
Yeah.
obviously we can also talk about the Mexican astrology, which didn't even get
Oh yeah.
contaminated with the old world. I mean, there are certain things that are native, and astrology is just a bunch of curious guys like us that read a lot and read from different places
Yeah.
and our own ideas and then form schools and so on and so forth. But, Yavanajataka is a very important book
It is,
because it is historically verifiable that this book is probably one of the most ancient horoscopic texts in India, and it came from Greece. And another important thing to mention is that Sfujitvaja, that's a hard one. He was a Greek in India. Okay, he was a Greek that lived in India, who probably knew Sanskrit and knew Greek, and he probably transcribed this book or this text, which is from Yavaneshvara, who we really don't know who he is. I mean, this guy could be Petrosides, could be Nechespo, could be Hermes Trismegisto. Or it could be any. 2nd century AD. Most of the big guys have already written their thing, Hellenistic astrology. So we don't know where this text came from. What we know is that this guy from Greek heritage transcribed it in India, and historically it is verifiable that this is pretty old, and that's something that most Indians don't like to hear, but it's older probably than Parashara, at least
I think so.
Historically verifiable. Most Indian traditions rely heavily on lore and myth, the same way that Hellenistic astrology had that through pseudo-epigrapha, right? The idea of I'm writing a book, but I'm saying it was written by, I don't know, Thoth or Hermes. And the Indians do the same thing, but they alluded to the 7 Rishis or to any,
I always forget who wrote the Mahabharata. Was it Vasya or was it the other sage?
I think it's Vasya.
It's this interesting thing where the Mahabharata is like actually a very mystical text, written by a sage, and it proclaims itself to be
given by the gods.
And it proclaims itself also to be more lofty than the 4 Vedas combined, numerous times throughout the Mahabharata that is stated. And, the Bhagavad Gita, the most popular episode from Mahabharata, is, a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna, but it's not, even though the text is a wonderful, perfect text, in my opinion, it's not literally written by Krishna. It's not literally the words of Krishna.
And that's when
so it's interesting.
That's when religious arguments meet academic arguments, right? When science and evidence meet faith and dogma, right?
Well, it doesn't diminish the wisdom contained in it.
Of course it does. Of course it doesn't. I'm sorry.
Of course it doesn't. Yeah, of course it does.
Of course it doesn't.
But it's just this interesting thing where like you're saying, a lot of times Indians do really play up this like mythological aspect of these texts, and I think that we need to have a bit of both. We need to have some critical thinking, and we also need to have some more mythical thinking. They're not separate. And so what we're going to find in Yavanajataka, as you already know, is that there are a lot of techniques in it that you can see later on developed into something else. By the time we get to Parashara, we have this full-blown complicated calculation called Shadbala, but we see the beginnings of it in Yavanajataka, which tells me that it was developed over time, that it wasn't some divinely revealed doctrine, that it was something that was pieced together by somebody or some group of astrologers who kept playing with it and said, this is a really good way to calculate strength.
I also wanted to say that this not only happens with religious figures or of deities, it also happens with real people. For example, Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras, he probably wrote them in the 4th or 3rd century AD.
Okay.
But most people say that Patanjali is much older than that, when historical records show that he's not that old. And Indian scriptures, or Indian schools, I don't want to say have that problem, but and it's something that when you go to Vedic culture, you think, this is This is millennial knowledge. This is antique, and it is antique. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But most of the transcription of that is not that old. I mean,
Right.
most of the transcription is not that old. I mean, the Rig Veda is probably 5,000 years old without a doubt. But the transcriptions of how it is.
Yeah.
Why are you laughing?
Just because I subscribe to the idea that the Vedas are 36,000 years old.
I'm saying 5,000 years old since 3,000 BC, more or less.
I don't have like historical evidence to support that, but
Well, anyway, that's pretty old, at least.
Yeah, it is pretty old, even if it's not.
But I'm not gonna say they're like 10,000 years old. You know what I mean? Or 16,000 years old, because that's like that's a hard that's a difficult jump to do. You know what I mean? But another thing I wanted to say is that before we start with the discussion, I wanted to mention that Pingree, who was a polyglot, and many people don't take the time sometimes to talk about this academic. He was a brain in languages, and this translation is a critical translation. So what this means is that he took all the known records of this written text, and he meticulously built a critical translation of the whole text from different pieces. So this wasn't something that was done early or that was done in haste. It was something that was done meticulously and with an academic disposition. And he opens the book with a quote from Baraja Mihira, which is very interesting. From
does he? I guess I haven't read that part.
Yeah, cool. It says, for although the Greeks are barbarians, they have brought this science to perfection and so are honored as sages. How much more honorable, then, is an astrologer who is a Brahmana? That's very interesting. I mean, Baraja Mihira, who wrote Brihadjataka, he's mentioning in Brihad Samhita that the Greeks
were masters.
And Jyotisha is the sixth Vedanga of Vedic thought. So it's the last one. And many times people, when they hear about the Greek influence of Jyotisha, they start freaking out that, oh, you're changing our tradition, this and that, but it's not true. I mean,
well, ancient Vedic astrology, which is not what we practice in the modern day, is much different. It relies more heavily on nakshatras.
Definitely,
it's not a horoscopic system as it's practiced.
It's more of an electional astrology. Yes,
it's more for doing rituals and oblations or ablutions and stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's very probable that horary, natal, I'm sorry, I just confused the Spanish.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's very probably that natal Hora came from a Hellenistic influence, not mainly, but probably some sort of influence came from that, and that's the mesh that you get with Jyotisha. And in a way, Jyotisha is a part of Vedic tradition, but it's something secondary. I mean, just like Ayurveda or Vastu, it's something secondary. So the idea that Greeks influence Vedic astrology is not, in my opinion, not that radical. It's not that invasive. And in the end, it enriches both cultures, because in the end, it's the same Indo-European culture. That's something that many people sometimes fail to realize.
Yeah.
So, Yavanajataka, let's start with the idea that it is important in the foundation of Jyotish, but it's not like the whole truth. It's like something that came in, gave a lot of information, but there was already some information from the Vedic culture that just meshed with this, and that's probably the origins of Jyotish, in my opinion. Without getting into specifics of tropical or sidereal, we're not gonna get into that. But I think that Yavanajataka has a lot to do with the genesis of Jyotisha as we know it today.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, great. That was a good introduction. And I think with that, we can jump into the first chapter. And we're planning to do chapters 1 through 9 in this video today. Just a brief kind of overview of these 9 chapters. So chapter 1. That's
the biggest one. Yeah, we got a lot of information there. Do you want to start?
Sure. So we basically get we basically get a description of the 12 signs,
which
and
I always love. I always
yeah,
love the description of the signs, specifically the signs in Yavanajataka. And you get this one here, and then you get it in another chapter we're going to talk later on. But I love
yeah.
the descriptions, and I use those descriptions by heart. I mean,
Oh, cool. Yeah, they're some of the best basic descriptions I've seen, and it's pretty much the same as like most of what we know about it today. I think one interesting thing is when it describes the Makara, which is the animal representing
Capricorn.
Capricorn. It says sea monster Makara, whose front is like a deer's, but whose hind leg end is like a fish, which is close to the goat symbolism we get, the sea goat symbolism we get in the more some of the other traditions. And so I think it's just interesting because at some point I think Makara became purely like a crocodile or something like that. But here,
I'm in the camp that it's a crocodile.
well, yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. Capricorn has always been mysterious in terms of its symbolism, and the crocodile makes good sense. But yeah, this notion that it's like half deer or half goat and half fish or whatever is, we find it here in the Yavanajataka. So that's really interesting.
And not only that, I mean, this also goes against the idea of Western astrology that Capricorn are mountains. I don't know if you've heard that before. The idea that since it's the 10th, it's like high places,
it's
but
like a high peak. Yeah.
Yeah. But here in Yavanaya, that states clearly
More watery.
that
Yeah.
it's like marshes, watery places,
Yeah.
which are also used in Western astrology in terms of riverbanks and this sort of things.
Yeah.
But it's marshy. It's a place where Saturn has to work.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that in Shloka 26.
Uh-huh.
Sujit Baya clearly mentions that the world is round. He mentions circular surface of the world. So we have a reference in 2nd century AD that the world is round for all those flat earthers out there.
Nice.
And in Shloka 29, for the first time, he mentions nakshatras, which is very interesting.
Yeah, he briefly mentions nakshatras, and it's interesting because he calls one of them Sarpa, right?
Ashlesha, yeah.
Yeah, instead of Ashlesha, he just calls it Sarpa. So I thought that was interesting.
Which Sarpa is snake.
Right, which is the deity or right associated with that.
And Ashlesha is a snake. And he mentions that, the last of Cancer is Ashlesha and the first is Maga. So you kind of get there maybe something to do with the zodiacs, which we're not going to get into it.
Yeah.
He doesn't necessarily get into it, but that part of the chapter 1 is very important because from chapter 26, from shlokas, let's do the correct words.
Yeah.
From shlokas 26 to shlokas 30, these are more or less, and it's my opinion, rejoicing factors in terms of sect, right?
Do you want me to share the screen so people can see it?
If you want to, I don't mind.
Yeah, let's share the screen. People see what we're talking about a little easier.
Sure.
Cool. So yeah, here it is, and
26 right there where I told you.
Right, 26. Yeah.
Thus had been told the circle of the division of the limbs of the Creator, who made the circular surface of the earth, which was what I was telling you about the idea of the world being round.
Right, and then down here is where the nakshatras are mentioned.
Yes, very briefly.
And actually, what's so fascinating about this text, too, before we go on, is two things. The nakshatras are barely mentioned at all. They're mentioned here, and then I think one more time in the very last chapter for electional purposes, not for horoscopic purposes. And then the author never mentions the nodes.
Yeah, which is very interesting.
The nodes aren't in here.
Yeah. Especially, I want to go first with the nakshatras. Maybe this was introduced here. I don't want to, because it's kind of weird that it's only mentioned like 2 times.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not an academic, but it's a probability. And the nodes are seldom seen, as you said.
I don't see them at all. I mean, I I haven't read the whole text back to front, but I've scanned through it.
We're gonna do it. We're gonna do it little by little.
Yeah, I cannot find them, so I'll be really overjoyed if I find them even just once as we go through this. But it's like it's really amazing because Hellenistic astrologers considered the nodes important, but they didn't consider them to be quite in the same level of importance as the planets, and that's like kind of a later development in Jyotish,
I believe it's a very modern development. The idea of, as we've talked before in other videos, the idea of the nodes as we know them today, I think this is a very modern thing that probably isn't even 200 years old.
Yeah, that is, but I mean, like we find them very heavily emphasized in Jaimini sutras, and we do find them heavily emphasized, of course, in Parashara. Maybe some other text. I haven't read every text out there, but yeah, Jaimini is a pretty old text, and Jaimini really gives a lot of attention to the nodes in his yogas. So. At some point, the Indian astrologers started really, really doing, I think, wonderful things with the nodes, but we don't find it here in one of the foundational texts of,
especially in chapter 1, which is like the introduction and probably the richest chapter in the book. I mean,
right?
You don't see them.
No. So yeah, if we just move on a little bit here.
As I was saying, 26 to 30 are just rejoicing factors in terms of sect of dividing the chart in day and night.
Yeah.
And which signs are day and night, which is also very a polemic in terms of rejoicing factors when you qualify planets in terms of sect, that people don't really know what defines a sign as a day sign or a night sign. And he kind of gives some clues. Yeah. But it's also very ambivalent here too.
Right, and in 31 we have the common Hora division of sun and moon for odd, moon and sun for even, and then he starts to describe some other things. So what I find really interesting is that Yavanajataka gives a lot of attention to not only Navamshas but also Saptamshas, which is mentioned up right here at the bottom. They're actually mentioned. They're one of the first divisions mentioned. Horas, Drekkanas, and then Saptamshas are mentioned. And then Navamshas, and then Dwadasamshas. So for Yavanajataka, the most important divisions are these 5, it appears, with the addition of the Trimsamshas, or what were called the bounds by Hellenistic astrologers. And we see the Trimsamshas the same exact way mentioned in Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. If we scroll down here, we find it right here in 42, right? The nature of the Trimsamshas. And it is my theory that these are a just a different version of the Hellenistic bounds or terms. They're just like a more standardized version, because the Egyptian bounds are all uneven in the divisions of the signs. So here we find the same idea, but just given in a way that is the same for every odd and even sign. And so the bounds are very important in Hellenistic astrology, and so they are given some degree of importance here in Yavanajataka as well. And furthermore, what's interesting is that, and I wrote an article on this for the magazine Celestial Vibes, the divisions Saptamsha, Navamsha, and Dwadasamsha are used in a much different manner than Parashara uses them. They're used in a way that that is different. It's not for marriage, childbirth, and family. It actually, he doesn't say exactly what they're for. He gives subtle hints. So we'll find that is a really fascinating thing about Yavanajataka.
We're going to talk about that in later chapters, right?
Yeah, we can talk about it later, because it gets emphasized later in its own chapters, and it's fascinating. So we'll leave it till later, but I just wanted to mention it. So these sections kind of describe that stuff. We even have,
and by the way,
Ashtiamshas here, right? The 60 portions of each.
Correct. That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah. And then we have some weird ones, right? 1800 Liptakas in a sign. I don't know what the hell that is.
Me neither.
What it was used for. He doesn't say how to use it, unfortunately, or not explicitly at least, right? So He, you know, he gives pretty much the same calculations that we're all familiar with for these, but like I said, we'll devote more time to these when we get to those chapters where there's delineations. I just wanted to mention it briefly. Did you want to mention anything?
Yes, I want to move to Shloka 59, which is a very interesting Shloka.
Okay, cool.
Okay, there we go. Shloka 59 says, the exaltation of the sun is the 10th degree, of the moon in the 3rd, and Jupiter in the 5th, and finds that of Saturn in the 20th, of Venus in the 27th, and Mercury in the 15th. Why is this interesting? Because these are the traditional Vedic exaltation degrees, which, as some might know already, differ a little bit from the Hellenistic exaltation degrees, right? The sun being 19 degrees, Jupiter being 15.
Yeah.
So, you know, what does this tell us? This tells us that, I don't know, maybe this was introduced here. We don't know. Or maybe these degrees were already known in India. Maybe they got changed later on subsequent transcriptions of the text. But the idea is that in Yavanajataka, you get different degrees for exaltation of the planets in terms of the Hellenistic norms per se, which is very interesting, because if this was a purely Hellenistic text, then those degrees would not be there, as well as the nakshatras, which also brings up the question that maybe these were introduced later on, as I just mentioned. But you know, it's there, you know, and that's something very interesting in my opinion.
I agree, and I wanted to just go back real quick to here where he talks about the different types of houses, right? Yes. So the Cardine is a Kendra, the next group is Panaphora, and the third Apoklima. Well, actually, these are all Greek terms, and the only difference is that Kendra is Kentron in Greek. So we have a lot of terms that are used in Indian astrology that have a Greek origin, and I think even the names of the zodiac have a Greek origin.
Which was the main as much as a lot of people know already, which was the main argument that Pingree used to sustain the idea that Jyotish or Vedic astrology was mainly influenced through Hellenistic writings, because these words are only found in Sanskrit in Jyotish terms, and these words come originally, most of them stem from ancient Greek words. So that's the connection he uses to justify the argument, which is kind of convincing if you think about it. At the same time, you know, we get the idea of the apoklimas, the panafara, and the kendras. But as you go on and learn more Jyotish, you see that these terms are not that used in yogas. They're used. Don't misquote me. They are used, but they're not as used as other techniques. In terms of figuring out yogas, figuring out strengths. I mean, obviously, Shatvala has a lot to do with directional strength, right? Which has to do with kendras. But the majority of techniques, in terms of Vedic techniques, that use these, in terms of Hellenistic techniques that use these, are very different, right? You know, Hellenistic techniques rely heavily on the types of houses planets are in, while Vedic astrology, this technique is there, but it's not as used as often.
Maybe not as prominent.
Yes, correct.
Sure. So then that's all good stuff to point out, because we want to get the subtle differences here. So then for like 57, for example, one moment. In 57, we get the introduction of the Upachaya houses, which are the same as they are generally speaking. But up here, right, when we get we start to get the meanings of the houses, right? I'm sorry.
What number was it? Did you write the number of the shloka down?
No, never mind. We start to get the meaning of the houses and stuff a little bit, but my point is that we start to see some classic Indian stuff, like he does say somewhere that the second house refers to family, which is not something we find in the Hellenistic tradition. So again, start to get these subtle things. But what I really wanted to point out, which I just saw, is this. This is quite Greek or quite Hellenistic and quite different from
sextile.
Modern Jyotish. They call the 11th the auspicious in every way, the 12th place of motion. So the 11th house was considered the most auspicious house by Hellenistic astrologers, but in more modern day Jyotish, it's actually considered to be like a mildly malefic house in some ways because of the Vavat Bhavam.
It's not necessarily a malefic house per se, but it's a yoga breaker house.
It's a yoga breaker, and it's the 6th from the 6th and the 12th from the 12th. So.
And it's the most, it's the strongest Trishadaya. So the 11th Lord will be very important in preventing the native from achieving great things, because he will be, I don't want to say misguided, but he's going to be more occupied with 11th house things, which...
Well, I mean... Yeah.
That's the principle. Because it's not a bad house per se. No, it's a bad house for Raja Yogas.
For whatever reason, we can speculate about it. For whatever reason, Parashara in his Raj Yoga judgment says that the 11th Lord cancels a Raj Yoga.
Yes.
I don't know why. I don't know why that is. People have come up with explanations for it and whatnot. I don't know what the reason for it is, but I do know that the 11th house from the Hellenistic perspective is a super auspicious house, and it's considered the house of the good spirit, which guides you toward the truth in life. So,
and I believe the sun gets rejoiced there, right? Or Jupiter?
No, Jupiter. Jupiter has a rejoicing condition there. So I don't really know what to say about that. It's the doctrine shifted over time. Things changed over time, and there are just different perspectives on it.
But let me just clear this: it is not an evil house.
Yeah, it's not an evil house.
House.
Yeah.
It prevents the native from achieving greatness. That doesn't mean it's a bad house. That means that greatness is not achieved. That doesn't mean that the individual, the Jataka, is going to be sick. It's going to be is gonna die. He's gonna get injuries. Those are dushtanas, right? That's the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th, which are also evil houses in Hellenistic astrology, more or less. But the 11th is a yoga breaker house. It's the idea of yogas. It's the idea
just for that one type of yoga, just for that one kind of system. And of course, if you have the planets in that house, it's not a yoga breaker. It's just the Lord's.
No, and it's
and that's what's interesting too.
Incredibly good for modern times. I mean, you get a planet in the 11th, and you're gonna be you're gonna be strongly affected by that energy, that planetary energy, to do things in the world, right? All planets do good there. However, it's the 12th from the 12th, so karmically, it's not that good for moksha. But who's interested in that to this modern day? Very few individuals, especially the people who have moksha yogas, to show that. Yeah, continue. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think the point that I want to make here is just that this is a different perspective, and so we cannot thrust more modern perspectives onto it. For the author of this text, the 11th house is auspicious in every way, and this author does not have the yoga system that Parashara gives for Raj Yoga. Exactly. So this is a different perspective. Okay, it's different, and we have to just make peace with that.
And I think they can coexist together.
They can, yeah. Because
that's the thing. Some people think that Trishadaya's houses are evil. Obviously, the 6th is difficult, but the 3rd and the 11th are not that evil. They just impede the person from getting a Raj Yoga.
Right, in that system.
That's it. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. So let's see. We also find somewhere in here the Hellenistic doctrine of sect, which
that's later on Shloka 83.
Okay, cool. All right. So let's move on a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
I definitely
which is very important because this differs from
Mula Trichonas. We have the introduction of Mula Trichonas here.
which is purely Vedic.
Yeah, uniquely Indian contribution. So that's cool. They're the same as they are for, standard Jyotish today. We get more descriptions of the signs and so on. And then here is something very interesting. And I'm writing an article on this, and my friend and I have talked about this a lot. This is something I've done a little bit of research in and thinking about. We get the aspect doctrine that we get later on in Jyotish, what most Jyotishis use, right? We get the aspects of the 10th, the 3rd, the opposition, the conjunction, the trines and the square of Mars, and the 8th aspect too. But Yavanajataka doesn't give special aspects to Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. This is just the aspects for all the planets, and he gives, he's saying, accepting the 2nd, 6th, 11th, and 12th signs from that which it is, a planet always aspects the rest. Their aspect is good when it is in good signs.
Which is a Hellenistic, this is a Hellenistic principle right here.
Sort of. Yeah. But then he goes on and elaborates on that. The influence of the aspect is complete in opposition, less by a 4th in the 2 squares, the 4th and the 8th, a half in the 2 trines, and a 4th in the 3rd and 10th signs. So exactly what Parashara says later on, with the exception of the special aspects. And I think Virahara Mira has this same doctrine. But it is my theory that there was some change or transcription error, because if we change the 11th house to the 8th house, and if we changed the 8th aspect, right, as well, if we got rid of that, because the 8th house is not a square from the ascendant. Earlier in the chapter, actually, verse 50, I noticed, right, he says that the fourfold ascendant, that basically the Chatur Lagna, right, the houses 1, 4, 7, and 10 are the squares of the ascendant. But here he's calling an 8th aspect a square. So my opinion is that if you just change this one thing and you said accepting the 2nd, 6th, and 8th and 12th signs, it would be the exact same as the Hellenistic, and it makes more sense and it's more symmetrical mathematically.
That's what I meant to say. I'm sorry.
So I am skeptical now that the 8th aspect really originally existed. The fact that people use it now and have used it for a long time and it works doesn't surprise me. It's not to say that it's wrong or it's bad or anything, but I look at this and I go, wow, this is one step closer to making these two systems really cohesive and gelling together. So I can't help but wonder if this was some kind of strange scribal error, or if it was a purposeful change of the doctrine, because it is a mystery. So I wanted to point that out.
Yeah, just like the nakshatras we discussed before, and which was the other thing we discussed? Which was the other thing that we just like the nakshatras and
and the nodes maybe, or
just like the nakshatras, the idea of things that are introduced later on to connect things and make things work. But yeah, you're totally right, man.
Well, we'll see. I could be. I don't know. I don't want to offend anyone, because I think that there are many great Jyotishis out there.
We've already offended, so don't worry about it.
Maybe, yeah. Well, no, I respect anyone who uses a set of techniques and is able to correctly interpret a chart. So I don't care if you're using the 8th aspect or not. I just think it's interesting, because for me, I don't use the 8th aspect anymore when I do astrology, whether it's Jyotish or Hellenistic, and it just it was always the one thing that sort of held me back. So when I found this, my friend and I
You are referring to the 8th aspect of Mars, correct?
Yeah. I just don't use it. I just ignore it. And that's what I do. So, anyway, moving on. That was kind of one of the most important things I wanted to mention. What else did you want to mention?
Shloka 83.
Okay. Oh, the sect, huh?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah.
Where, and we've mentioned this. Well, we haven't mentioned this in a video, but we get
about it,
in Parashara, but it's kind of screwed there, right? In chapter 3, as you mentioned, as you correctly signaled it for me.
Yeah.
Parashara mentions sect, but he mixes some planets if I'm not mistaken. Do you remember which
Yeah,
were
he
the ones?
puts Venus as strong in the day, and I think Saturn maybe as strong in the night. But this doctrine that we see elucidated in Shloka 83 is the exact same doctrine we see across the board in many Hellenistic texts. And so at some point, I'm just thinking that the doctrine was changed, maybe by accident, maybe on purpose. I don't know. But I love that this is here because this is the doctrine I use in analysis.
And once again, just like the types of houses, these are references to technicalities that are seldom used in yogas.
Yes.
These are technicalities that are used in some things, but are not used in the majority of cases when you analyze yogas. You don't take
Yeah.
into consideration if it's a day chart, if it's a night chart. You sometimes don't take into consideration if it's a quadrant house, a candescent house. You don't take into consideration many times these technicalities that
Yeah.
are often mentioned in the introduction of classics like Parashara and here, but that are seldom mentioned again in the following chapter. So this is another, let's say, inkling of evidence that might indicate Hellenistic influence in these Jyotish texts. Techniques that they would read and then they wouldn't use because they didn't know how to use them, or didn't really didn't really mix well with the traditional Vedic techniques. So, we can use a lot of hypotheses to explain why they're here, why they're not mentioned, or why they're not used that much. But it's just another interesting point to mention, without a doubt.
Yeah. And in verse 82 here, I wanted to point out too that we have this doctrine, which we also find in later Jyotish texts and stuff, right? The planet aspecting its own sign,
Yep.
or the planet who's exalted aspecting that sign, like if Mars was aspecting Capricorn, or Jupiter or Mercury. And later on, he also adds Venus in another verse, right? Are aspected by these places, then it makes the sign and the planet stronger. So, very old doctrine. But I think it's interesting because the Hellenistics don't really talk about Mercury doing this, but
Correct.
in this text and in Jyotish they do, and I think
Especially Jaimini.
especially Jaimini. It's one of the main. It's like his second strength or whatever. Jupiter or Mercury aspecting a Rashi boosts its power.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. That's all I wanted to say. Yeah.
Another thing is that you are not being told what type of aspect is here. So that's another interesting thing. You don't know if it's sign aspect. You don't know if it's planetary aspect, which is another thing that sometimes confuses people.
I think it's these aspects that we got here, because he doesn't give any other aspect doctrine other than this. So, but what's interesting about this, right, is like if a planet was just doing like a third aspect, right, which is normally we think of it as a Saturn aspect, right, it would be only 25% boosting, and Parashara gives that same thing and then applies a mathematical principle to it to like narrow it down a little more. But I think what we should also observe here is that some astrologers have interpreted Parashara's instructions to negate sign boundaries, and that may be true, but in the more ancient texts like Yavanajataka and the Hellenistic texts, the sign boundaries are not negated typically. And so that means that if I had a planet at like 0 degrees of Aries and a planet at like 28 degrees of Taurus, let's say, they're technically 60 degrees apart, but for the ancient authors, they wouldn't be an aspect because of those sign boundaries. They have to be in the signs that correspond to these aspects. So we don't have the mathematical component in Yavanajataka that Parashara's text gives. We have a sign aspect doctrine, just like the Hellenistic authors give.
Let's move on to the big one.
What, Shadbala or?
No. Shloka 107. If you have any shloka before that, let's mention it.
I don't remember where he mentions Digbala, but he mentions Digbala just the way we are familiar with it. But then he starts to mention also other aspects of what became Shadbala later on, which are like right here, right? Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus are strong to the north, Saturn, Moon to the south. Then we get the moon is strong in the first part of the night. This whole thing, this is in Shadbala, and Digbala is there too, somewhere in here.
And you kind of get also
Yeah.
in 86, you get some qualifying factors for sect.
Yeah.
Moon, Venus, and Mars are during the night, which are
Right.
the night sect, and Mercury,
He can be either sect.
He's always ambivalent, and the Sun, Saturn, and Jupiter are during the day. So you get more references towards Hellenistic sects, the sect.
Right. And this same doctrine, I think almost exactly the same, makes it into the Shadbala calculations in Parashara, if I'm not mistaken. So again, we have the beginnings of what later Shadbala, with the exception of, I think,
which, for those who don't know,
Uchabala is not in here as far as I can see, and one of the other balas, like the retrograde one, I don't think is in here.
Ucha.
No,
Ucha. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'll remember now. But just to give you a hint, just for people who don't know,
here's Digbala. Sorry, here it is.
6-fold strength measurement that is used in Vedic astrology.
So there's Digbala in 88, exactly the same as we have it later on. And so, I just like to point that out because it's just so interesting how originally it was just a little simpler. It wasn't as mathematically complex, and it was just you would just kind of tally all this stuff and then do something with it. Theoretically, so we do see a progression happening, obviously. Okay, so you wanted to jump down to 107.
Yes, it's Shestavala, the idea of strength by movement.
Oh, that's the one that's not here. Yeah. I don't think it's here, at least. I could have missed it, but cool.
No, but you get Digbala. We already mentioned Digbala, right?
Yeah.
Okay, 107.
Yeah, okay.
This is a big one. This is a big one. So it says in Shloka 107, it gives some friendship schemes that are very different from those from traditional Vedic astrology, which they say in 107, it says, Jupiter is the friend of the sun, but the rest are its enemies. All except Mars are the friends of Jupiter. All except the sun are the friends of Mercury, and all except the sun and the moon are the friends of Venus. One finds that Venus and Mercury are the friends of Mars, Jupiter and Mercury of the moon, and all except Mars, the sun, and the moon of Saturn. Know that the rest are enemies, and that the same relationships hold among the men born under the influences of the several planets.
Yeah,
this is huge. I mean, This is very different from what we usually get from Vedic text. And I did the chart here for the video, and basically everything is different from the traditional Parashara friendship scheme, except the enemies of Venus and the enemies of Saturn. Everything else is very different. Especially,
you gotta send me that, bro.
Oh, it's right here. Especially because there are no neutrals here. So I mean, it's really weird because at the same time the schemes do not necessarily. I don't make sense of it because it doesn't fall under sect. It doesn't fall under traditional Jyotish precepts, except the enemies of Shukra and Shani, as I've just said. But I mean, it's a really weird shloka.
And what's interesting is it may not be exactly the same, but Al-Kabisi, who is Persian, and then later Bonatti, who is Italian, give a similar list of friends and enemies.
Oh wow!
To this, because the one thing that is the same that sticks out in my mind is that they also said that Mars is the enemy of Jupiter. That was the big one, and so it's similar to this. It may not be exactly the same,
which is really weird because Parashara in Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, after giving the Arishta yogas, he gives a couple of combinations that assure the native protection, greatness, and one of them, believe it or not, is the juxtaposition of Jupiter and Mars, which is very, very interesting because it contradicts this directly. Jupiter and Mars in quadrants and kendras with good dignity help the native overcome negative things throughout his life. But with this scheme, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and in this scheme too, we don't find this in Hellenistic texts. I don't see this in any Hellenistic text. So it's a unique thing. It has a mysterious origin, clearly, and there is a rationale to it, which I have yet to totally decode. But for example,
there is, but
like,
you haven't decoded.
No, like Jupiter and Venus being friends.
I mean,
is probably based on the fact that they're both benefics, for example.
Yeah, but the idea of Mercury and the Sun being enemies, I mean,
that's interesting. So all except the Sun are friends of Mercury, and all so the Sun is an enemy of Mercury, right?
Because I mean, they're always together.
Then he juxtaposes this before with this odd kind of instructions, which is again similar to Parashara but different because it's going to be based on the chart, right? The planets which are in the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 9th, and 12th places from another planet's Mula Trikona are its temporary friends, as is the weak planet in its exaltation, and then he gives the rules for enemies. So what this means is that theoretically, you look at a chart, and let's say you want to find out who the temporary friends of Mars are. You have to see where the planets are from the sign of Aries, his Mula Trikona, and you have to go, oh, well, like in my, let's say like my own chart, I have a planet in, I have Jupiter in Cancer, the 4th sign from Aries. So Jupiter is temporarily Mars's friend in my chart, but the question becomes, does this override these instructions down here? Are we supposed to combine them like Parashara says? Because like you've pointed out before we started the video, there's no like neutral thing given. There's only like if a planet's in the sign of its friend or of its enemy. There's no like gradation happening. And it's, again, it is a different technique than we find in Parashara. So I really hope, and maybe we'll have to do it. I don't know. I just really hope somebody explores these concepts and sees finds out how they might work in practice, you know?
And he changes the rules for temporary friendship.
Parashara does, right? Or
Yeah. No, I mean, well, yeah, vice versa. I mean, these rules are different from the Parashara rules because Parashara's rules, I use aquí, I say it in Spanish, it's entre tres and dos a la cuatro. So it's basically the 2 planets after and before. So the 12th and the 2nd are friends. The 3rd is enemy. 4th, 5th are friends. Then 6, 7 are enemies. Then 8, 9 are friends. And then 10, 11 are enemies. So you're getting here instead 2nd, 4th, 5th. So you don't get the 8th, right? So it's a different...
Wait a second. I thought, I could be wrong, but the way I remember it, and it's been a while since I've used it, was that you take if a planet, you're not using the oh wait.
These are the techniques to figure out temporary dignity.
Yeah. So I remember if a planet is conjunct a planet in its own sign,
it's an enemy.
It's an enemy. And then in 212, they're friends. In 311, they're friends. And in 10-4, aren't they also friends?
I use in between 3rd enemy, then 2 friends, 2 enemies, 2 friends, 2 enemies.
Huh, I guess I learned it differently.
It's
weird.
Yeah. I just did it just to be sure because I use it. I have like that's the way you find temporary friendships in terms of the first step you have to do, and then you combine it with natural friendship schemes, and then
I just thought that basically 1st and then 5th through 9th from a planet were its temporary enemies. That's what I remember.
No.
Okay, well, I'll have to investigate after that.
Don't worry about that.
I might just be misremembering
it. It's in chapter 3 of Brihat Parashara Hora. And I have a series of videos in Spanish in my YouTube channel if you want to see it.
If only I spoke Spanish better.
Yeah, you took 7 years of Spanish. So
yeah. So I just, but I really don't.
That says a lot about you, or says a lot about your educational system.
The educational system here is not that good, but
yeah, don't worry. It's all part of the plan. Okay,
so yeah, but it is different, and of course, in this system, 2 planets could be conjunct and temporary friends, which is interesting because it's based on the Mula Trikona. It's not based upon the planet's position. So
yes, and this is no. I'm sorry. This is we got. You're totally right. I'm sorry. This is from the Mula Trikona position.
Oh, the one you're reading.
Yes.
That's what I thought.
Yes,
that's why I was like, what?
You're talking.
Am I that crazy?
Yeah. But this is the scheme.
7 years of Spanish all over again.
This is. Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the scheme you find out why. This is the scheme you use to find out the natural relationship.
The natural friendships. Okay, cool.
Yes, I'm
Great.
sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, and
you're welcome.
yeah. So yeah, we just again, it's a little different here. And yeah, it's just a fun thing to find too.
Yeah, I mean that scheme is weird. That's something that is seldom mentioned. I think when people talk about Yavanajataka, they don't talk about this scheme, which is really weird, and which I don't know if have you seen it before in other writings in other traditions?
Well, like I said, Al-Kabisi and Bonatti give a scheme that I have a chart somewhere for on the internet.
But that's like.
But I think it's different than this.
That's Al-Kabisi is probably how much 800 years after this.
I forget. Al-Kabisi is definitely one of the
900
medieval
AD?
astrologers. He might be 7th, 8th, or 9th century. I cannot remember. But
so this is like 600 years after this.
Yeah. So. Okay, and just like this author, those authors don't really tell you how to use this. Although this author tells you a little bit how to use it later on. All right, so I wanted to point out too down here we get some differences with the elements. We get basically the same thing except Jupiter now rules air and Saturn rules something called wind.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah.
Ether mentioned. This is a little more similar to like a Hellenistic doctrine. Because Jupiter is considered sanguine or airy in the Greek medicine. Typically.
Maybe it's a typo,
Maybe, yeah. Although I think he mentions it again later too. He starts to explain, the windy, airy stuff in a later shloka. But then we get
the gunas
thing too, the gunas, and I've actually written 2 articles for Celestial Vibes where I explored this for those interested, and I came up with my own system of the gunas by just thinking about this versus Parashara and whatnot. But yeah, the Jupiter, Mars, and Sun, the 3 most masculine planets are Sattvic. Venus and Moon, the most feminine, are Rajasic, and then Saturn is which is a neuter planet, is Tamasic, and Mercury takes on the nature of whatever planet he's joined to. So a bit different than Parashara, who gives Venus and Mercury as Rajasic and Saturn and Mars as Tamasic. Bit different.
And Jupiter, Sun, and Moon as Sattvic.
Right. And just to throw it out there, my own version is, well, no, actually it's complex, so I won't get into it, but it's just slightly different from this. And then, of course, we get the gender thing here for prediction, and Saturn and Mercury become neuter, as I think they are later on too.
Which is a big debate in Hellenistic, right? The idea of Saturn being female or male.
It's not a big debate. A couple people found like one single text where the person mentioned it as potentially female, and then they had a hissy fit about it and made it into a bigger deal than it needed to be.
No, exactly.
Yeah, but it's one text.
In Jyotish, it's very simple. He's neuter.
Yeah, I like that better. Ibn Ezra, for example, wrote in Hebrew. He was an astrologer writing in Hebrew, and in Hebrew, the sun is a feminine.
The same.
So we can get really out there with this stuff. A lot of people, I think, are sort of freaking out about this because they want things to conform to gender politics.
Yeah, the same as in Babylonian astrology. The moon is a male, and he's the father of the sun. Imagine that.
And in Tibet and Norse cosmologies, it's the same. Moon is male and sun is female. So there's an esoteric reason for this, but this is talking about how to predict things concretely. This is saying, are you going to have a male child, a female child? That's really what it's mainly used for. Is the person going to be more masculine or more feminine in their characteristics too? So it really has nothing to do with modern day gender politics as people understand it.
I'm sorry, Lars, did you just assume Saturn's gender?
I may have as
Okay,
as
then
neuter.
I'm sorry. I got to stop this recording.
But actually, on a side note, I have noticed that people that identify as transgender, even if they're not having
Have
gender
a lot of
assigned,
Saturn Mercury energy.
a lot of Saturn, Mercury, and sometimes, and usually the nodes are in there somewhere too,
Yeah,
because the
Ketu,
nodes invert. Yeah, the nodes invert.
Ketu with Mercury. Yeah, Ketu with
Mhm.
Mercury or Ketu Saturn right there.
Right, right. So not all the time, but a lot of the time, yeah, there's a heavy Saturn for people like that, which is
And
cool.
even if they're not necessarily transgender or homosexual or bisexual, you
Yeah.
kind of get an androgynous vibe from them.
Yes, absolutely.
Because I've met people with Ketu Saturn Mercury conjunction, and they
Uh-huh.
give that vibe off very easily.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it works very well in practice, and that's what we're concerned with as we analyze this or any other text. So yeah,
Chapter
we're,
2.
we're we're still on chapter 1. Yeah, well, we can get to chapter
Yeah,
2.
but the other chapters are from 2 to 9 are just
They're pretty simple.
easy
Yeah.
breezy. Yeah, yeah.
I think for the rest of this chapter, you just want to get a copy and read it. We've got casts, we've got pretty much everything you can imagine.
Which are things that are repeated in other Yotish texts.
Yeah. And then, we have descriptions of the way the planets look and stuff. A little different than some later Jyotish stuff, like the sun has a lot of curly hair.
These descriptions are very traditional in most classical texts like Parashara, Faladipika, Saravali.
Right. So we don't really need to.
Yavanajataka. You get these once and time again, and I mean they're not always gonna be identical. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't, but that's how things are.
Cool. So, okay, moving on to chapter 2 finally.
Chapter 2 and chapter 3 are very interesting because we get Horas and Drekkanas. Horas in chapter 2 and Drekkanas in chapter 3, which would be Horas, the division of the sign in 2, and Drekkanas, the division of the sign in 3. And what Sfujit that's why they always call Yavanajataka and they never mention the author's name because it's
so
really
difficult to say. Yeah.
Sfujit, he gives some allegories, some figures to each of these divisions, which are very interesting.
Yeah.
I tried to compare these, and I think we could take chapter 2 and 3 together.
Yeah.
But, I mean, I've never heard of figures given to Horas. I don't know if you've heard that before, but
no, this is unique to this text, and as far as I know, it's not anywhere else. This is like the only images given to the Horas that we have currently.
You kind of get that with the deities that you get for the D60 in Parashara, because you kind of divide each degree in 2.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting.
So, you kind of get, it's not the same at all because you divide this in half, there you divide them in 60. But, this idea of the images are very interesting because they immediately remind me of magical astrology.
Yeah, of course. And
which we're going to see in Drekkanas. But here with Horus, I don't know how it works. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I have some things to say about this. First, I want to point out that the Hora and Drekkanas elucidated in this text are not used for wealth and siblings. They're not related to the second.
That's very true. That's very true.
We don't know what they are. They're the kind of their own thing. He doesn't mention
anything about. Yeah, exactly.
So they're their own thing, okay? And so we want to be careful just assuming again that it's like it is in modern day Jyotish. It's different, and that's fine. But like we have here, again,
this was written 2,000 years ago. Let's just
So this is like an example of one of the images. You can read it if you're watching this video. Very, very intense imagery, powerful imagery, and I'll just go to some of the other ones too.
They're all very intense.
Yeah, and so I use Horas in a couple different ways, kind of based on just contemplating this text and whatnot. First, I want to see, including the ascendant, how many of the 7 planets, excluding the nodes, are in a solar or a lunar Hora, because that will give me a basic overview of, is the person more solar or more lunar? So that's very useful. The second thing you can do is that...
Which would translate into masculine energy or feminine energy, correct?
Exactly. And so then the second thing you can do is that classically in in medicine, the right half of the body is typically solar and the left half is lunar. So in medical astrology, you can take the lunar half as the left side of that particular body part, and the solar half is the right side of that particular body part. So if I was looking at like the person's hands through Gemini or the third house, right, the solar half of that sign would be the right hand, and then the lunar half could be the left hand. So that's a really functional way to use it and makes good sense. And then the final thing I've toyed with is that let's say a person does have an affliction in, say, their right hand, okay, and we do like a prajna chart or whatever, or we don't even have to do a chart. We just know, okay, the person has an affliction in their right hand. We can go to Gemini and just read about the solar Hora of Gemini, which is going to be the first Hora, if I can find it. Sorry. I think I just... Sorry.
No, you got to go to the next page.
Yeah.
Stop moving the document so much, Lars.
Sorry. Okay. First Hora in the third sign. Okay, so we could like take this image and see if energetically and psychologically it might give us some key to interpreting the person's affliction. That's a little esoteric, and I can't say that that definitely works or not. I haven't really played with it enough, but I kind of like the idea of this personally. So, any thoughts from you?
I don't know how it's used, to be completely honest.
Okay.
I think this has to do with some type of magical thing that we don't know.
Yeah, could probably be used in magic.
Because I really don't, especially the Hora chapter, the second chapter, these are just allegories. Maybe these were deities. Maybe these were some sort of half decans. I mean, that's not even the correct term. I mean, some type of division. I don't know, man. I mean, maybe they could allude to stars. I mean, I really don't know.
Yeah, it's mysterious, and
just to be honest with you, I seldom use the Hora chart because there's so many ways to interpret it. I just don't know, and you can divide it with the sun and moon, or you can do the other division. So it's just more confusion. I really don't know.
Well, and I don't use it as like a divisional chart, as like a standalone chart. And in fact, Yavanajataka seems to be suggesting that you don't create standalone charts out of the divisions. And we'll talk about that more, of course, as we go
later
on.
Chapters. Yeah.
It's really interesting. And in Hellenistic astrology, you would put the 12 parts around the Rashi chart, the horoscope. You wouldn't make a whole new chart out of it. So it's just a different way of thinking. It's more bound to the birth chart than it is like all these little, thought bubbles of other charts. So, but yeah, we pretty much have this same kind of idea with the decans. We have an image for each decan,
which is more common,
which is more common. There's a lot of different versions of the decan images. This is one of my favorite versions personally. I also like the version from the Liber Hermetis, which is a pretty old Latin translation, I guess, of a Greek text. But the images are, again, like, when you compare them, they start to get really different.
Yeah, I tried to compare them with Agrippa's images and with the Picatrix images, and they don't mix either. I mean... Yeah,
it's sort of unfortunate.
Some things are there. Some things like a bow, a black man. I mean, they're kind of there, but they don't align perfectly. And
no, they don't. So anyway, these probably relate more to like magic, like you're saying. They can be used to describe things if you know what you're doing, but otherwise we don't really know how they're supposed to be used in the Yavanajataka.
And most importantly, like you said, we have no mention of richness, of resources in the Hora, and we have no references of brothers or sisters in the Drekkana.
Nope, not at all. So, okay, so mystery not solved, but let's move on to chapter 4, where he describes the objects associated to the signs, and I think objects.
This is a very good chapter. I really
it's great. It's great.
This is a very great chapter because you kind of get the essence of the signs, and as I said before, Yavanajataka for the descriptions of the sign is great. It's just amazing. You know,
Yeah, it
and
really is.
I use them. You know, what I use them to explain the signs is that I use the context of the sign, since the sign is more or less the unconscious manifestation of God, and the planets is the conscious manifestation.
Yeah.
So it would be like you use the cast or the role of the planet in the planetary cabinet, and you put them in the space described by the sign,
Right.
Yavanajataka, and in other texts in Parashara mainly, and other classics, and you just build upon that to
Yeah.
create a space, and then you describe the sign and the position of the planet in the sign by this allegory. For example, Taurus, which is very related to like farms, villages, places where cows are, you know, like a little farm, and then you put the queen here, which would be the moon. Then the queen is in this context, and then you
Yeah.
realize, why is the moon exalted here? Well, the moon is exalted because the queen is in the farm, and the villagers love the queen. They just love her.
Sure.
They want to give her food. You know, it's like this image from Beauty and the Beast. You know, the
Sure.
French village. You know what I mean? It's like that, and that's there. You start doing some sort of meditation where you kind of understand why these planets get
Yeah.
their rejoicing here, why they get um, debilitated in other spaces, and so on. So I really like this.
It's great.
The planets descriptions are also good, but I really like
The signs, yeah,
the
there's something
signs.
special about
Yeah,
them. Like the fact that it seems like most of the fire signs uh, rule over mantras, according to this text. That's useful information. I think what's most useful about this stuff too is it's very practical in horary astrology when you're trying to find something
definitely.
from one.
Oh, definitely.
But it's also extremely useful for remedial measures if you think about it. Like if the person has an afflicted fourth house, and let's say it's Taurus, you know, and their fourth house and fourth lord is afflicted, you could actually recommend to them like, make offerings of ghee, or to like plant grass around their house, or if they can't
Or become an organic farmer.
yeah, or if they can't purchase an oxen, maybe they can go and bless an ox or something like that, or they can donate to a
Stop
farm.
eating meat. Yeah.
Yeah, or stop eating that kind of meat, or Lord of Games parks and garlands, like they should maybe go hang out in a park nearby their house more or something. You can come up with really organic free flowing remedial measures that oftentimes remedial measures become become a little dense, like, oh, you have to do this mantra and let me look up this specific thing.
108 times.
Yeah,
times
but with this, you can just make it up, because you're not even making
that's how you do it. I mean, that's
Yeah.
how I do remedies.
That's the real way to do remedies,
Yeah.
because especially in the West, a lot of people aren't going to want to chant some Sanskrit mantra, right? So
I mean, the mantras help. Don't get me
the
wrong,
mantras can
but
help, yeah.
but if you don't have a spiritual practice, it's just
No,
ridiculous.
and if you tell someone like, go make this offering to this Indian deity,
Yeah, like a Shiva Linga or something like that. Yeah.
that's not going to resonate for them. But if you
Nope.
tell them like, go and once a week go visit an ox,
Yeah.
that's kind of a little out there, but it's not so out there that somebody in like the US or
But
whatever.
the important thing is, if the person does not have a spiritual practice, that's the sort of remedy you give. But if the person has a spiritual practice, you give that remedy, and then you tell them to do a certain mantra for whatever he or she.
Or you come up with an affirmation, because it doesn't have to be in Sanskrit and that sort of a thing.
And these descriptions are very good. I mean, read the one for Virgo, which always makes me laugh.
Oh yeah, this is great.
I don't know if you've read it, but it's always
great. Yeah, because it's really contradictory too, in a way. Like the 6th sign Virgo are virgins, sexual intercourse, right? So what?
No. It's
virgins
the last
back
part.
then were not.
The best part is the last part.
Okay. But virgins back then weren't really about sex. Anyway, so virgins, sexual intercourse, love suits, unions, bashfulness, women. Where did you want me to read to? The
women who move their buttocks.
Oh yeah, women who move their buttocks. Yeah, that's great. So some kind of dancer, some kind of
I when I read that, it reminded me of like music videos or something. I mean,
yeah. It's pretty funny.
It's very funny that you get, and he writes an interrogation mark. It's very funny. It's very funny how you get, because as you said before, I mean, Virgo is harem, right? But it's not the modern interpretation we get from it. It's just the space for women, which not necessarily has to do with sexuality.
Right.
And Virgo is sometimes a lot related to commerce and to business, but that's like a secondary aspect of it. The main aspect of it, it's female energy and the idea of a sacrosanct place for women and for service and that. But this description is very lively, and it's just an example of how good these descriptions are.
Yeah, and I like this one, freedom from passion, which is like an ascetic kind of thing, perhaps.
Yeah.
So yeah, we get these wonderful descriptions and so on, and then we get kind of similar ones for the 7 planets. And so, like you said, though, they're a little less extensive and a little less impressive, but still useful for the same kinds of things.
Definitely, without a doubt. I mean, this is the ABCs you need to learn if you're going to start astrology.
Yeah.
These are the bread and butter, man. You need to learn this by heart because this is the language. If you want to learn to read music, you need to learn how to write and read music. If you want to learn Braille, you got to learn how to read and write Braille. And if you want to learn astrology, you got to learn these significations by heart.
Yeah, and I've never like memorized all of this stuff, but you as you like learn it and read about it, what you commit to memory is more like the essence of it, like you start to understand that like in a later tradition of astrology, the sun actually deals with is one of its significations is hunting, and that was probably because during the medieval period, kings and nobles were the ones that would hunt the most for sport, so you
because
start to
they have the most free time.
Exactly. So it's kind of
and
like
the guns. Exactly.
These lists give us a way to understand the essence. We're going from the outside in through these lists, and so it's very useful to study. And this is perhaps the best list I've ever seen in the Yavanajataka.
I mean, for signs, Yavanajataka is the best.
Definitely,
and
for signs.
Also, it's good, but for signs, it's like the best.
Stellar. Yeah, amazing.
Because when you read Parashara with the signs, for example, he just gives you the qualities of it. He tells you, for example, Aries is the Ram, its Lord is Mars, it's a Rajasic, it's fire, it's Dharma, but he doesn't give you the nitty gritty things,
No. Yeah. So cool. All right. Chapter 5.
Yes, chapters 5 through 9, which are the last we're going to be discussing in this video, have to do, we start getting into yogas, and chapter 5 starts talking about conception.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. I don't know, do you do conception astrology in the sense of I mean, it's just in the classical world it worked, but today people have sex almost every day, especially when you are in a relationship. So the idea of this is very difficult because sometimes people don't remember when they conceived before they gave birth to a child.
Yeah, if I was gonna do an electional chart for somebody to conceive, I would probably consult this pretty heavily because it's
definitely a muhurta. Definitely
most in-depth instructions. And it's strange though, the order of the planets it gives for the 9-10 months are rather different from what I've seen in like a Persian text where they just give the order, which is the Chaldean order starting with Saturn. But he gives a very kind of strange order later in here. I don't know. I don't feel the need to dwell too much on this chapter, but did you have anything you wanted to like say about it?
Not really. Like we're moving into the yoga chapters, which are just combinations specifically. Nothing really special. I mean, I don't want to say nothing really special. That's not the correct phrase. I mean, it's just like any other classical text where he just starts, talking about different combinations with possible results, which is very traditional of any Indian classic.
And
continue.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say this is a great chapter to start to get a feel for how he wants you to use the Navamshas. He gives a lot of emphasis to the Navamshas here, especially for the moon and the sun to a certain degree. So it's it's just interesting from that perspective, but it's very arcane stuff that's rather difficult to use.
I mean, it could be used. The
Sorry.
thing, no, I mean, it could be used. The thing is that these are, the same type of combinations you get in other books that you
Yeah.
gotta sit down, you gotta memorize. And these were the memorizations that ancient Jyotishis would memorize in order to do astrology by just memorizing thousands of combinations, which are yogas, instead
Sure.
of learning a systematic approach to it. So it's just a different perspective in terms of how to approach astrology.
Yeah, and I think too, like this, there's a lot of good stuff in here for just analyzing the birth chart, like these some of these shlokas, like if Saturn and Mercury are in their own navamshas or in cardines of the ascendant, or in navamshas of the ascendant, and the sign in which the moon is, or they have aspected them, then they produce neuters. They produce a person who's more gender neutral or whatever. So
These
yeah,
combinations are great if a computer programmer would take all these things and put them into a program and just,
yeah, that
which
would be interesting.
which is something that most Yotish software programs do. But yeah, this is just too intrinsic and too heavy to be discussed one by one. It's just
Yeah,
combinations about conceptual astrology, about arrangements before birth, and so on and so forth. And in chapter 6, you more or less get those two, which could be translated into bala yogas, bala being baby. Bala arishtas are combinations that are given
yeah.
when negative things happen in the birth of a child. But these would be bala yogas in terms of what would happen in during the conception of a child and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and finally, here's that part I mentioned to you: Sun, father by day, Saturn by night, and
Mm,
Venus, mother by day, and Moon by night, which is also something we see in Hellenistic and medieval Persian
that's very
astrology.
interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, in that's something you see also in medieval astrology.
Oh yeah, heavily.
So Saturn would be male.
Yeah, Saturn for the medieval astrologers is more male typically, definitely.
That's very interesting.
And I've always considered that Saturn has something about to say about the father because it represents, discipline and doing your due
Structure.
diligence and stuff. So, um, yeah, so it's a bit different from some other texts, but there actually are other Jyotish texts that talk about this same doctrine. I just don't know them off the top of my head, but
Don't worry about that.
yeah. Anyway, so chapter 6.
Chapter 6 is more or less the same, and it's more or less the same. So if you
Yeah.
want to go to chapter 7,
Right. This is there's a lot of stuff in here about like will the father be present and then what kind of house is the person born in? Again, very useful for understanding like sort of the nature of the planets, right? Like if Venus is influencing, it's a lake house. If Saturn, it's a grass hut, which lets in many cold winds. It's kind of a harsher environment. So it's kind of some similar stuff to what Jaimini talks about too, about houses as well.
and not only that, as you mentioned before, it's perfect for muhurtas. You kind of get
Yeah.
the idea of what would be the best time to do certain things in terms of bringing a baby to the world. But of course, most people give birth in hospitals.
Yeah,
So
yeah. So
it's whatever. Which would be interesting to see if in India, which I guess must happen, that astrologers and doctors work together to bring babies at a certain time, according to omens and arrangements.
sure. Sure, yeah, that's interesting, and maybe in today's more American, Western, whatever world, you could use this stuff to describe the conditions of the hospital room.
Yeah, probably.
Like
Yeah,
if it's a dark room where the lights aren't working,
yeah.
Saturn is probably emphasized.
And let me tell you, I mean, this is something I've thought about. That would be a great topic for a documentary. Just going around with a full-time Indian astrologer that works with people and gives birth, and
Yeah,
does all these things in the Indian context. I mean, and this thing about childbirth would be an integral part of it. But yeah,
cool. Yeah, that would be
chapter
interesting.
chapter 7, we get dignity results, which is very interesting.
Yeah, and what I noticed with this is that if we actually go through it, basically what it's saying is that exaltation yields like the most
Great
powerful,
things. Yeah.
right? Then Mulatrikona is like a lord or something like that, or like it's almost like exaltation is like describing an emperor, And then Mula Trikona is describing like a king. And then own sign is describing a lord. And then friendship sign, this is the most interesting one. Friendship and enemy signs are basically planets in the signs of friends is like saying that you basically get help from friends around that planet. And in enemy sign, you have trouble from enemies. So Yavanajataka is taking it to quite a literal level, which I really liked. And
that's how I use dignities, by the way.
Cool.
Yeah,
well,
that's how
I never thought to do that. I don't, it just never occurred to me, but it's like, what a great way
you should learn Spanish, because I did a video on that too.
Oh, cool. Awesome. That's really cool then that you.
Well, how I equate it, I mean, that's a great way, but how I equate it is Exaltation, you are in a vacation home. You know, you're on a holiday, you're in an all-inclusive tropical paradise. In Mula Trikona, you are in your house at the best moment. In Mula Trikona, you are at your house, but there's some things that are not, perfect.
Oh, you mean in own sign? In own sign?
Yeah, no. Swakshetra. What did I say?
You said Mula Trikona twice.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Swakshetra. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I do that a lot. I'm sorry for all our spectators. You've seen, I get confused a lot. So, Swakshetra, you're in your house, but, maybe your internet is buffering and you're not getting a whole signal, but you can fix it. Best friends, you're with your best buddy, bunking beds. With your friend, you're with a guy, neutral, you're doing Airbnb. You don't know, but he's taking care of you. Enemy, you're with your nemesis. Worst enemy, worst enemy, you are with the worst person ever. I mean, like Carthage with Rome, or Hitler with Stalin. And, when you are debilitated, you're homeless. So, yeah, that's how I use it. But these are basically, expressed by Fujitisvaya here in Yavanajataka.
Yeah, and then chapter 8 just continues this, but by saying, how many planets are in their own exaltations, right? Like if you could have 7, which I don't know if that's really even possible, right?
Six. Yeah.
Well, he goes up to 6. No, he goes up to 7 here. 7 planets in the signs of their exaltations produce one who is Lord of the earth, bounded by the sea.
So we're talking about like Rama or Krishna here. So yeah.
Yeah, I just love that though. It's kind of hilarious.
Astronomically, you can only get 6 exalted. Because
that makes sense.
Mercury.
Yeah, how could Mercury be exalted?
No,
the sun is exalted. Yeah.
Yeah, you gotta have Mercury or Venus are not gonna be like that. I don't know. I've always wanted to see a chart where that happens, or at least theoretically. But maybe he's mentioning maybe exaltations in Navamsha and in the Rashi at the same time. I don't know.
He might be. There's an interesting shloka later that gives us insight into how he deals with the dignities again, which we'll come to. I think it might be chapter 9. I don't know, but oh no, it's right here. What am I doing? It's right freaking here. This is one of the most.
You gotta write the shlokas down.
Right? Yeah, I know. No, I'm so I'm pretty lunar about that kind of stuff. So okay. Anyway, so this is one of the most useful shlokas in the whole text. The influence of the planets in the degrees of their exaltations is complete, in their Dvamshas as in their Mula Trikonas, in their Dwadasamshas as in their houses, and in the degrees of their dejections or their enemies, it is the least. So what this means is that basically it's best for planets to be exalted in the Rashi naturally, and that's probably where the strength Ucha Bala comes from in later Jyotish, which is measuring a planet's distance from its exaltation degree. But if a planet's in its own Navamsha, it gains dignity equivalent to it being in the sign of its Mula Trikona. And if it's in its own Dwadasamsha, the dignity it has is equivalent to if it was in its own house, Swa. And so that is a really unique way to use, well, maybe not unique, but unique to us. It's a really unique way to use the subdivisions for understanding dignity. And I basically just go by this. It just works it makes so much sense.
Can you give an example for people to know?
So, like a specific chart example or?
No, just hypothetical.
Oh, okay. So like, let's say, sorry, I'm getting a bunch of Okay. Anyway, so let's say you had a planet.
Just for people to know, Dwala Samcha is the D12.
Yeah, the D12. So let's just say you had a planet. Let's say like Mercury, or let's say Venus was. I want a real example now. Jesus.
No, just make it up.
Okay. Let's say Venus was in Gemini, and Venus is just kind of like whatever in Gemini. I think it's in a friend sign in this
Yes,
text.
he's in a friend sign. He's either I'm sorry, the phone is ringing. He's either in Gemini. He's either in a best friend or a neutral sign. In the end, dignity.
Okay, I just mean according to Yavanajataka, I think Mercury is still a friend of Venus. So let's just say
in the scheme. Well, if the scheme here, Venus, he's a friend. Yes.
Okay, so Venus is in a friend sign, but then let's say she was in her own Navamsha, like she was in the Navamsha of Libra. Okay, so she'd be in she'd be in early Gemini then. She'd be in like 1 degree Gemini or something.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
Okay, whatever. So she's in her own Navamsha, so that means that her power increases as though not only is she in a friend sign, but she's also has power as though she were in Libra, like a Mula Trikona power, And then if she were just in her own Dwadasamsha, like if she were in Libra or Taurus by Dwadasamsha instead, then that would be also very auspicious, but a little less auspicious or powerful than if being in its own Navamsha. So does that make sense?
Yeah, he's using like the Navamsha, the D9 and the D12. He's using it like double, like a double reference for the end dignity of the planet, which is interesting.
Yeah, and the way I use this in my own practice is that I use the
first see the Navamsha and then you see the D12.
Well, I actually have a habit of going to the D12 first.
Because it's the shortest one, yeah.
Because it's just simpler in a sense. It's 12 and 12 with the signs. So I take the D12 position to show something about how the karmas and stuff represented by the planet will just sort of naturally unfold. But I take the D9 position to suggest how it will affect us inwardly and thus how we are likely to deal with it on a more inner level, So if a planet like has good dignity by, let's say, 12th part and in the Rashi, then that planet can show some like good things coming your way, stability, whatever. But then if it's kind of more difficultly placed by Navamsha, you might still have kind of a hard time like emotionally and spiritually during that period, even if things are stable. And I have this exact situation with like my Saturn, without revealing too much, where it's very strong by Rashi and by 12th part, but it's a little weaker by 9th part. And so the Saturn stuff in my life has outwardly not really been that trying, but inwardly it's been a more difficult experience for me. And we also see this in like Trump's chart too, where he has some strong D9 placements. And you find that, I don't know what his 12th part placements are like, but you find that with the D9 placements, he bounces back really easily from the shit that happens in his life. Yeah. It almost doesn't even affect him. He just bounces back,
Let me get it right.
Whatever.
So
I'm great. I'm doing whatever I want. And
usually Rashi is external. Navamsha is internal, right? Yeah. So D12 would be overall?
Rashi to me is generally everything.
Okay.
And D12 is more like if
No, go by order. D9.
Okay, so D9 will be internal, yes.
Okay, and D12?
And then D12 is like, imagine if each placement is like a little knot in a rope, and then you start to untie the knot. That's like the D12. It's like how it unfolds. And it also has something to do with the root, I think, of the karmas, because it's like naturally the 12th house, so to speak. So it has.
So you could relate. I mean, not necessarily, but what was the division of the 12 parts for the Hellenistic astrology scheme?
It just starts in the sun. Like if it's Gemini, it starts with Gemini, and every
what is that called? Dodecaedron? No.
Dodecatomoria.
Yeah. Dodecatam. So it's not. I don't want to say it's like that, but you kind of get an idea with that.
Yeah.
But it would be how it would develop in terms of the whole and the internal.
Yeah, pretty much. And it works really well to do this,
And
honestly.
I believe we don't get to see this in other classics, this idea of the D12 in relation
Not
to
really.
Navamsha in terms of dignity, which is very interesting.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting too that Parashara likens it to parents and ancestry because, in a way, that makes sense because a lot of our karmas
The
come
karma.
through hereditarily. So it's like he's saying, like, the parents, maybe literally, but also metaphorically, is like, what's the parent of this karma? What's the original action that's giving birth to this result,
And not only that, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that in some place he mentions that the karma of the mother would be in the first 4 years, the karma of the father would be in the next 4 years,
Oh,
and
wow.
then something happens in the next 4 years, and then the karma of
Sure.
the person starts right before, Jupiter matures. So I gotta see, this is a good idea. This is an idea that could, that it could be developed into something more interesting because it makes a
Yeah.
lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, this chapter is just delineating having, two to seven planets in the
Oh,
sign.
which is really cool. I mean,
Yeah,
the idea of the
friends,
dignity.
enemies, blah blah blah. Yeah.
How? Let's see. How much? What would be your shloka here
Uh, like what if?
in your
Uh,
chart? Do you want to
uh
do that? No, you don't
yeah,
want to do
sure.
that.
Like I have two exalted planets, so we can
Oh
go.
yeah. Oh, holy shit. Okay, let's see.
Yeah, and I have
Badass
one.
here.
I have one in
Let,
domicile.
let's
So,
do the experiment. So let's see.
and my brother has the same thing too. He has two exalted and one in domicile.
Wow,
So
that's great.
yeah, so two planets in exaltation, a man who is famous and wealthy. Well, I'm not famous and wealthy yet, but you never know.
Okay, okay. So I have six friends, and mine is in the next page. So I have six friends and one in
Okay.
great friend.
So,
So so I'm more
where
balanced
are
than you.
we?
Stop moving the document so
Sorry,
much.
if
Okay,
six
there we go.
planets are in their
Yeah,
friends'
50.
houses. Yeah.
He has many pleasures and horses and
Nice.
much beauty, and he acts like a prince. Obviously, I do act like a prince. I don't know. I don't have a lot of horses. I used to like riding horses. I don't have a lot of
Cool.
cars either. So yeah,
Okay.
but
Yeah,
it's
it's a
cool.
metaphor. Yeah.
You could do that. It's something that you usually don't get to see. I believe there are other texts that do something similar to this, but I really like this part.
Yeah, and then again in the previous chapter, he seems to give. Does he just give? He just gives. Um. Oh no, I'm sorry, I skipped it.
So don't
Yeah, he
worry.
gives the specific planets. So, like Jupiter in exaltation, famous, honored by king, noble and wise, and of good righteousness. And just to give an example, again, I have Jupiter exalted, and I actually have been friends with many like sort of famous people or people with royal heritage. Actually, it's quite funny. Like I have a friend who has a high clearance in the military, and then the other friend, they're both married. The other friend, she has like British royal blood, and like her uncle was like the first prime minister of Barbados. And
Nice.
then like as a kid, I had one of my friends was like a famous barber, his dad, and then the other friend's dad was a famous photographer in Vietnam
Nice.
era. So I had that does apply to my life. So sometimes this stuff is literal.
Nice. I have no exalted planets, so I don't relate. But
Okay.
I do have Saturn debilitated in Navamsha. So let's see that. Probably something very positive. You don't get
Debilitated in Navamsha.
Yeah, you don't get those, right?
Gosh, I don't think I have. I have.
Nah, don't worry about it. Let's move on to
Okay.
chapter 9. I'm just trying to make a funny
I have
funny.
some. Yeah, no, I have some enemy stuff that happens for sure. I have some difficult stuff that happens. But did you want to look at it or no? Did you
Yeah,
actually?
just to see, I mean.
Oh, okay. So what? So we're looking for.
Saturn debilitated.
Oh, in that previous chapter. Okay. Does
Yeah.
it show it? Let's see.
Mars.
So this is for the enemy's house. I don't. It's not giving debilitated, huh?
Okay. Well, I don't. But I'm exempt.
Well, are you tormented by griefs and sicknesses?
Oh no, I think it's this one. A Saturn, a lord of men who eats the food of others. I do that all the time.
Where
And
is that?
number nine. What
Oh,
is it? Is this when it's debilitated? No.
no, this is friend sign.
Ah.
but but is it in the friend sign in the
Yeah, it
Rashi?
is in a friend sign.
There you go. Yeah.
No,
so-
no, it's neutral. It's neutral, but it's friends. It's
Okay.
a sign of disposition. Yeah, I do that all the time. I do eat other people's food.
Nice.
So yeah, Yavanajataka.
Although I do that too, so I don't know.
No, but I do that. Yeah, like it's a bad habit. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I've
Okay.
gotten into fights because of that.
Oh, oops. Okay. All right. No problem,
Okay.
man. All right. So finally, this brings us to chapter 9, our last chapter for this very long and
Which
epic video.
are more yogas for distinction, and he
They are,
starts
right?
talking
Yeah.
about sadhus. We start getting into like moksha.
Oh, and we have Vargotama as well. We actually have it mentioned in chapter 1, I think, too, but we start to see it again, too. So Vargotama is a very old concept as well in Indian astrology.
Which would be the same dignity in D1 as in D9.
Yeah, exact same sign placement. Actually, though, for this author, I think he also would extend it to Dwada Samsha.
Without a doubt. No, and I mean you can extend Vargotama to any Varga chart.
That's true. Yeah, you could just logically, right? Yeah. So here he starts to also extend things to like, okay, you may think, oh God, I'm doomed. I have like planets and enemies and fallen houses, but then he starts to extend it to Navamshas and say, you know, if all the planets are in their own Navamshas, right, or their friends' houses, or their friends' Navamshas, they produce a lord having, you know, power over the 4 continents of the earth and stuff like that. So this is where he starts to get into like how the subdivisions will alter things, and talks about the birth of kings in this first part, and then second part is the birth of lords. So yeah, it's yogas for basically status and power. So if you've got such and such, you're going to be like a king. If you've got a little less than that, like a lord. And then, you know, he basically continues on, you know, birth of kings and holy men. He gives some interesting things for sadhus here. You know, and then, yeah, birth of kings and thieves, sort of like tyrants is kind of what he seems to get at here in this last part. It's like a king who could be like a tyrant, or a person who's like a thief, you know?
Yeah, and he also mentions the idea of what happens when malefics form yogas and when benefics form yogas, which are also very helpful to understand certain arrangements.
Yeah. I like this part here because it is kind of strange. This if benefic planets, oh, it actually starts. Yeah, it starts earlier, but like if benefic planets are in their own Vargas and in the angles, then the moon is in the house of the benefic planet. They produce ascetics, yogis, and men of excellent qualities. This is interesting because like I would expect to see ascetics produced as a result of
8 or 12, yeah.
Yeah, or like malefics, like, or planets in like, yeah, the Upachaya houses too.
Maybe because it says with benefic planets, and the benefics are Brahmins, Venus and Jupiter.
Yeah, so it's probably not like a radical ascetic. It's probably someone who's more like a priest and functioning within the confines of the social order, you know, like a pundit or somebody living in a temple.
Yeah, like a pandit, yeah.
In Tibet would maybe conform. So that's kind of interesting. And then, yeah, the stuff for kind of like quote unquote evil. But, you know, I guess I should have written it down because there was this other part where it talked about like planets being like bright or not bright. Blazing, here it is. Yeah, it's at the beginning of chapter 9. Blazing, not blazing, or blazing. And I took that to mean, I don't know what you think, but sorry, I took that to mean
day.
No, I took it to mean combustion. Yeah, possibly, because like,
well, you gotta find adipta.
Yeah, I looked it up and it really, I didn't.
What does it mean?
It means blazing. It means blazing or not blazing. Adipta.
Or maybe it is a planet getting out of combustion.
Well, look at it. Yeah, like if benefic signs in the cardine, planets and signs are in the cardines, which is the angles in benefic navamshas, and if the malefic planets are not blazing and are not in the cardines, they cause the births of yogis and munis who have the divine eye and supernatural powers. So this would be malefics not combust, if maybe, versus if in this yoga the benefic planets are in the cardines again, and the malefic planets are blazing, possibly combust, and are also in cardines, then there is born an honored enjoyer of the worth whose enemies are overcome by his wisdom. And the reason I thought that maybe that means combust is because if a malefic planet's combust, it's technically being destroyed.
Hidden, yeah.
Or hidden by the classical rules. So it's like your enemies being overcome, and you don't need to become an ascetic. Whereas if they're not blazing, they're not destroyed, so to speak, you're going to become an ascetic because there's going to be that influence or something. So that was kind of my theory.
I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess that sums it up for this video. Any final thoughts that you had, Fernando?
I mean, so far so good. The subsequent chapters we're going to see are just combinations and combinations and combinations. So, the nitty gritty, the good stuff was in this first round we did, but we're going to be discovering a lot of interesting stuff as we go on.
Cool. All right. Great stuff. Well, I hope that everybody watching this who's made it through to the end has enjoyed this.
Unshare the screen, unshare.
Oh, okay.
So we go back to gallery, to close
Stop
up.
share, yeah.
There we go.
I hope everyone has enjoyed this who's watched it. And please, hit like and subscribe and check out Fernando's channel as well. And his website, I'll have that in the description. And, share this around and, find yourself a copy of the Yavanajataka and start getting to work. Yeah,
and I think this is the first of the first. I think we're going to do this for several books. I'm looking forward to it.
Cool, yeah.
I mean, nobody has ever done this before, going, chapter by chapter of an astrological book. But yeah.
So we're kind of maybe
pioneers.
Yeah, we're hopefully we don't get lost while we're pioneering, right?
Yeah, we got lost a few times in this video, so yeah, don't worry about it.
All right, well, great stuff, my friend, and I'll see you in the next video we do on this text.